Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Professor Ipshita Bansal from BPS Women's University, Sonipat. Today, I am going to talk about barriers of listening from the paper Business Communication. By the end of this module, students will be able to understand first, various barriers which hinder ineffective listening, and second, the students will be able to learn the techniques to overcome the listening barriers. In this era of globalization, people are very busy, and the urge to multitask, that is, doing many things at the same time, is very high and often becomes the biggest barrier in listening. It is not easy, but most of the people do this while someone is speaking. At the same time, people are engaged in something else that is happening in the immediate environment. They are either talking to someone or thinking about household works or preparing in mind what to reply. All these small instances lead to big barriers in listening. A major part of one's success in listening will come from accepting that one can only do one thing at one time successfully. So, what are the types of barriers to listening? Deep listening is miraculous for both listener and speaker. When someone receives us with open hearted, non judging, intensely interested listening, our spirits expand. This is what Sue Patton said once. To have better listening, it is essential to be aware about the barriers of listening and the techniques to overcome these barriers. The following are some variables that create barriers to listening. So, what are the listener oriented barriers? Receiver or listener oriented barriers can be seen in the course of interaction between people. Although, at the initial phase, that is, when the speaker is formulating his message into words, at that point of time, listener's role is passive. He becomes active when he starts listening, understanding, and grasping the information. Similarly, like speaker, listener is also equally responsible if the situation gets worse and the message is discontinued, or if it leads to some conflicts due to the misinterpretation. Let us discuss in detail the listener oriented barriers. Listener oriented barriers can be lack of interest in listening, preconceived and premature ideas, perceptual alteration, egocentralism, selective discernment, daydreaming, physiological reasons, focus on actions, self-centered listening, or emotional barriers. Speaker-oriented barriers can be due to paralinguistics, complexity of the concept, exceeding the time limit, or difference in speed. Environment-oriented barriers can be because of medium of communication, timing, physical barriers, proximity, cultural differences, and role of relationships. Second type are the speaker-oriented barriers, which can be controlled or uncontrolled. Attempts should be made on the part of the sender to recognize and eliminate these barriers. Before the person starts delivering the message, the quality of her speaking style cannot be judged. The wrong delivery becomes the barrier in listening. As the sender is the creator of the message, she needs to be tremendously careful not to raise barriers. If her communication gives rise to or signify that there are barriers, the communication comes to a pause. As the goal of the speaker to make the listener effectively listen, and understand cannot be achieved. Some of the barriers that are sender oriented are as follows. First listener oriented barrier is lack of interest in listening. It may result due to two reasons. Listeners feel that they know the topic well and their knowledge is so wide that there is little left for them to learn. Second, listeners feel that the topic is not relevant to them. They listen to information within their interest areas only. In these two conditions, receivers stop listening when they really feel that the topic is not of their interest. So they know more than what is being conveyed, or the speaker have nothing new to offer. Second is preconceived and premature ideas. If the listener is very rigid for the preconceived knowledge and is not flexible in grasping the change, it results in listener-related barriers. Premature evaluation jumps to conclusion. As psychologist Carl Rogers has noted, the problem is the very human tendency to evaluate what is said from one's point of view only. This immediate evaluation becomes a barrier. Third, perceptual alteration. Differences in perception is the situation in which we hear the message the way we want to and miss the real meaning and sender was trying to convey. Although the speaker wants to convey some particular message, but we perceive it in our own way. It occurs most often when listeners interpret words based on their own experience and attach different meanings to it. Fourth, egocentralism. Ego is one of the big barriers in listening. A new employee who joined recently in the organization will not be listened by senior employees, or a person with less experience will be underestimated by those professionals having more experience. This is because of the ego barrier which comes in between the two individuals, as the listener often refuses to listen to opposing view because of the self-image. In this picture, it can be easily understood. The speaker is talking about saving the environment, but audience on the one hand are saying it is just a fad to talk about environment concerns these days. And some of the audience are thinking, I have been researching this subject for the past 20 years. I don't think there is anything new to learn. So this picture very clearly shows the perceptual and ego-related barriers which are putting a very great obstruction in effective listening. The next is selective discernment. It is rightly said that half knowledge is a dangerous thing. Listeners suffer from the barrier of selective discernment when they pick up information selectively. That is, they listen to those points which they feel are of their use and leave the other information. As the message is not fully listened to, it acts as a barrier and leads to miscommunication. Next is daydreaming. Sometimes it happens that the listener is lost in some other thoughts and is not able to receive the information or message. The thoughts can be having some earlier memories or maybe some future plans. Due to this, the present ideas are not listened to and the message is lost. In the picture, we can see that since all the listeners are sitting in the one room, the message which they are listening to will be the same. But different people are daydreaming and thinking about something else. So the message content will be lost and listening will not be effective. The next listener-oriented barrier is physiological reasons. Reasons like ill health, fatigue, sleeplessness, mood swings, anxiety, depressions, or other related problems also work as barrier to listening. The casual attitude or lack of effort or concentration also results in barriers. This attitude or mindset is structured by listeners' unique physical, mental, and emotional characteristics. The next barrier is focus on actions. Instead of listening to the words, the listener shifts their focus on the actions or appearance of the speaker. The listening barrier here plays role when the listeners, instead of concentrating on words or message, shift their attention to the way of communicating and the dressing up of the speaker. In this way, speaker's non-verbal signal act as barrier and the message is not taken by the listener. That is why it is advised to the school teachers that when they dress up for school, the dressing should not be too gaudy so as to distract the children's attention. Next barrier is self-centered listening. Rather than listening on what is being said by the speaker of the listener concentrates on what he needs to reply. This is known as self-centered barrier towards listening because here the listener is not listening but just phrasing their own ideas to be spoken out. 10th barrier is emotional barrier. Emotional needs take many forms. Bentley explains that when we are listening to someone speak, it is possible that what we hear can trigger prejudicial or emotional responses. The feeling thus generated interrupts our ability to listen well to the speaker. This is not the fault of the speaker, but the remembrance of past feelings which may lead to resentment, anger, disgust, and works as an emotional barrier because with such emotional state we hardly could listen properly. The next speaker-oriented barriers of listening is complex concept to understand. It is important for a speaker to know about the listeners, who they are, from which profession, their age, their experience. Many times the listeners are from different background and are new to the subject which is going to be discussed. Despite this, the speaker starts with a complex concept rather than beginning with a simple one. As the listeners do not understand the complex concept of the subject they are new to, they stop listening. Next speaker-oriented barrier of listening is exceeding the time limit allotted for speaking. The speakers suffer from the poor habit of not respecting the allocated time. That is, they exceed the time limit and keep on speaking. When the speech is too long, it deviates the concentration of listener and becomes a barrier for the listener to grasp the message. This affects the interpretation of the message and becomes a barrier in listening. The first speaker-oriented barrier is paralinguistics barrier. It refers to vocal communication which separates from actual message. Paralinguistics mean the manner of speaking, the tone, voice, pitch, loudness, pauses and silences all matters. The monotonous or dull voice, low volume, makes the topic uninteresting and becomes a barrier to distracting the attention of listener. The third type of listening barriers are environment-oriented barriers. Many times, listening barriers are not due to either the speaker or the listener, but they are due to the surrounding environment in which the communication is taking place. Environment, or which are sometimes also called context barriers, are those which are caused due to some technical problems in the medium used for communication, or due to certain distractions or turbulence in the nearby environment, or they can also be caused because of certain noise factors in the surroundings. Besides these, incorrect selection of medium of communication, wrong timing, poor lighting, improper space or distance between individual, frequent movements of body parts or unnatural gestures, etc., can also be responsible for creating environmental barriers. The important environmental oriented barriers are discussed below. The fourth speaker oriented barrier is difference in speed. A person can speak fewer words in a minute in comparison to listening. The listening capability of an individual is much more than speaking, and due to this gap, the listener's mind wanders towards other things. Due to the vacant mind, conversation suffers with barriers, as during this free time, many listeners surrender to external distractions. Therefore, speaker needs to understand its audience and make variation in his speech accordingly. All these reasons affect interpretation of message and become the barrier in listening. The next environment-oriented barriers of listening is physical barriers. If the sitting arrangement is not good, that is, the chair on which the listener is seated is not comfortable, if the ventilation is not good, or if the temperature is too hot or too cold, all these are responsible for listening related environmental barriers. At the same time, any kind of noise or sounds in the communication space equally affects listening. The next environment oriented barrier is proximity. Proximity refers to space or distance maintained between speaker and listener. The level of distance we maintain with others depends largely on our level of familiarity with the other persons. The space is less between friends and more between professionals and even more with strangers. But yes, it is true that we cannot share the secret with someone standing too far. And this is how sometimes, if the level of proximity is not balanced as per the requirement of the communication, it works as the barrier to listening. The first environment oriented barrier to listening is medium of communication. If the medium of communication is teleconferencing or video conferencing, there are chances that listening may suffer. At this time, retaining interest will be very difficult because speaker may be sitting miles away from the listener. Besides this, the technical issue of network cut, low audibility, noises and sounds, malfunctioning of devices, and other interruptions may also arise as a barrier. The second environment-oriented barrier to listening is timing. Time is a very important aspect to deliver the message. To keep listeners attentive, it is necessary for the speaker to choose the subject delivery according to the time. If the discussion on dry topic is started post-lunch, the listeners will feel bored and will not be interested in listening, as the mind is not active at that time. And for a speaker, it is very difficult to attract the attention of audience. Students, we discussed various barriers to listening that we face in our day-to-day work environment. These barriers hamper the effective listening, and therefore it is important for a listener to practice the skill of listening to overcome these barriers. Overcoming the barriers to listening is a difficult task. It demands patiently working on them. Thus, effort should be made by the speaker, listener, as well as others concerned with the process of listening to remove the barriers. The fifth environment-oriented barriers is cultural differences between the speakers and the listeners. In contemporary times, cultural diversity at the workplace is a common aspect. People with different cultures work together, and these differences between culture acts as an individual listening barrier. As in some countries, it is acceptable to question the speaker while the conversation is going on, but at the same act is not tolerable in other cultures. The query between conversations is considered disrespectful. Thus, cultural differences become a barrier to listening. The sixth barrier is role of relationships. A strong bond between speaker and listener helps in good understanding. But if the bond is weak, it becomes a barrier in listening. If the listener is having antipathy towards speaker, or if the speaker is not liked by the listeners, then even the golden words spoken by the sender will not be grasped or listened to by the receiver. The impression of a speaker in listener's mind will determine to a large degree what they learn or what influence the speaker made on them. So let's now consider the techniques to overcome listening related barriers. So, how to overcome the barrier of lack of interest? If the message is boring, use questions to probe for more interesting and inspiring material. If the information is too difficult, ask the speaker to simplify. Next is how to overcome the barrier of preconceived idea or knowledge. Even if a person is an expert in a particular field, it is vital to listen to others' ideas. One should not block oneself to selective learning by listening partially or being prejudiced against the speaker. Avoid criticizing and focus on the content, not on the speaker. As we can see in the figure, listening barriers distort or destroy your message. Barriers hamper the effective listening. Therefore, it is important for a listener to practice the skill of listening to overcome these barriers. So, let's now discuss the techniques to overcome speaker-related barriers. Speaker-related barriers are more difficult barriers to overcome. These are the barriers which are caused on the speaker side, but listeners have to make an effort to listen attentively, despite the shortcomings of the speaker. Firstly, the listener needs to be aware that there are speaker-related barriers which might distract him. So, as listeners, don't allow the distraction to build to a point where you stop listening. To overcome the barrier of selective discernment, it is important to listen with an open mind, as it helps in gaining something new and knowledgeable, or a different viewpoint. Develop a positive attitude, seek areas of interest, and remind self that something of value can be learned. To overcome the barrier of perceptual alteration, evaluate the context properly, as different words may have different meaning for different people. Focus on what is being said, then on who's saying it. Strive for removing personal biases. Respect others' freedom of values and beliefs. At least try to understand another's viewpoint if not necessarily agreeing with it. To overcome ego-related barriers, Understand that ego means edging God out. Once ego takes over, effective listening and communication is not possible. Accept that ego harms the process of listening. Accept that learning does not have any age. Sometimes the younger and less experienced people are much more knowledgeable and can have or evolve new ideas of working. Be ready to listen to the ideas of juniors also. To overcome physiological barriers, receivers need to keep away from listening when suffering from ill health for better understanding. For better understanding, listen when you are physically comfortable and are able to concentrate on what the speaker is trying to say. Speakers on their part should create comfortable environment before they speak so that listeners can listen to them effectively. To overcome barrier related to daydreaming, concentrate instead of dreaming. A complete attentiveness towards the content of the speech and not the delivery, along with an unprejudiced, objective, and cooperative attitude helps us to listen effectively. If possible, take notes to keep the mind from wandering. Consciously make effort to focus on what the speaker is saying and practice again and again. How to overcome emotional barriers to listening? This barrier is difficult to overcome for those who are not in control of their emotions. It is better to avoid conversations when one is angry or excessively sad. Introspection should be done to become aware of and to control one's emotions. Learning the skill of emotional intelligence can help one overcome this barrier. To overcome listening related barriers, one should shift towards full body listening. Listen not only with your ears but by keeping full body in a listening mode. Keep your mind and heart open by openly using the five senses of your body. Assume a friendly posture while interacting. Use all the components of full body listening, that is, active listening, attentive listening, visual listening, and empathetic listening that we discussed in the previous section. So, students, let's now consider the techniques to overcome environment related barriers. So, firstly, how to overcome the barriers related to medium of communication. Before listening through the help of technical devices like telephone systems, computer systems, mass communication systems, make sure the systems are working properly. Ask the speaker to give pauses while speaking if it seems difficult to grasp the message at one go. Secondly, how to overcome the barriers related to physical environment. Try to find and be in comfortable environment during the conversation. Find a comfortable chair, adjust the heat or cold or the ventilation in the room to comfortable levels if required. Close the window if noise is coming from outside. Identify and eradicate distractions before the listening activity starts. If distractions cannot be eliminated, then simply increase the concentration. The first technique to overcome speaker related barriers is to evaluate the paralinguistic. Maintain the eye contact to observe non-verbal signals, understand the actual meaning, and provide feedback. Complex content is reasonably simple to deal with by asking questions for clarification. Seek clarification on an acronym or abbreviation. Ask questions. That is, you may ask the speaker, "What do you mean by this or that?" is the simplest form of asking the questions. To overcome the barrier of exceeding the time allotted, Politely give cues to the speaker about the shortage of time. Remind him about the next task to be done or about the time of the next speaker. The next technique to overcome the speaker-related barrier is adjusting to the speed of speech. The mind wanders because of the speed difference in listening and speaking activity. It is helpful to jot down the points or make the notes instead of relying on memory. Do not interrupt the speaker in between. It is better to write down the questions and clarify once the speaker has finished with his message. Request the speaker to slow down if he or she is speaking fast. Overcoming these listening barriers may seem difficult. Practicing some simple techniques will take away the difficulty, and the rewards for doing so are great. The next technique to overcome environment-related barrier is concerned with right time and space. Choose the right time for the listening activity. Maintain the proper and acceptable space between people during discussions or other related communications. Another technique to overcome environment-related barriers with respect to cultural barriers is that listeners need to be observant and patient to understand the value system of other cultures so that they may act accordingly. To avoid misunderstanding in intercultural communication, it is necessary to clarify with the speaker to ensure that listeners have understood the message correctly. So, now we have come to the end of this module. Let's now summarize what we learned. Listening includes hearing and understanding various sounds, pitch, intonation, tone, words, etc. It is a two-step process. The first step is to listen carefully. The second step is to check and analyze. Things which hinder us in effective listening act as barriers in listening process, which may lead to misunderstanding. The barriers can be listener related, speaker related, or environment related. To become a good listener, we have to overcome listening barriers. This may seem to be a difficult task, but it is not impossible as there are various ways to listen thoughtfully. To be an effective listener, one needs to introspect, be aware of the surroundings, take suitable measures, and continuously practice being a good listener. Thank you.